Thanks so much, Kelly. And thanks to all of you for participating in this. As Kelly said, you'll get the PowerPoint and some handouts at the end after the webinar. And my phone number and email are on the materials. Please, of course, don't refer clients directly to me, but if you have questions about issues that you're seeing connected to public benefits, I'd be happy to try and respond and to connect you to people in other parts of the state as well. Thank you. So we're going to talk today about accessing public benefits from the county assistance offices for survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault. Just as an overview, I'm guessing most of you are already familiar with the range of public benefits offered by the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services. That's the agency that oversees and administers the county assistance offices. It's the county assistance offices that your clients would be interacting with at the county level. But although they're called county assistance offices, they're actually part of the State Department of Human Services. So TANF, which is a cash assistance program for pregnant women and families with minor kids, more popularly known as food stamps. Medicaid, which provides health insurance that's available to most low-income people in Pennsylvania. Emergency Medicaid, which is Medicaid for immigrants who are unable to access regular Medicaid because of their immigration status or lack of status. LIHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, and Child Care Subsidy. Today, we're going to talk in some detail about TANF, SNAP, and Medicaid. We're not going to talk in detail about LIHEAP or child care. I want to highlight a couple of special programs that are available because of the pandemic. So the first is what's called the Emergency Assistance Program, and it is only available until July 12th, or it may close sooner if the funds run out. So far, the numbers of applications have not been high. And so at this point, I would expect that it will continue to be available until July 12th. But if you have a client who's potentially eligible, you want to encourage them to apply as quickly as possible. And later in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little more about the EAP. What I'll say right now is just that it's a cash assistance program for pregnant women and families with kids. SNAP, in addition to regular ongoing food stamps, we currently have something called SNAP emergency allotments. People don't need to take any action to get the emergency allotments. If they're currently getting SNAP, they will receive an emergency allotment in the second half of the month, but they will only receive that emergency allotment if their if their food stamps are less than the maximum. And we're going to talk a little more about this later in the presentation as well. The ironic piece of that is that the people who are poorest get the maximum in SNAP. And so those people are not getting emergency allotments, unfortunately. And that's something that CLS is doing advocacy about. There's also a program called Pandemic EBT, which you may have heard of. This is designed to replace the free breakfast and lunch school meals that children were receiving, which were interrupted when the schools were closed. It amounts to approximately $370 per child, not per month, but for all of the school that was missed from the time that schools closed through the end of the school year. Families that were already getting SNAP received the pandemic EBT on their EBT cards, on their access cards where they regularly receive their SNAP, and they should already have gotten it. Families who were not receiving SNAP, but who were receiving free school meals, received a separate EBT card in the mail. Those have been mailed in waves, starting, I believe, last week. And I think it's over a 2 or 3 week period. So people should have received them or should be receiving them this week or next. The state has agreed that emergency Medicaid is available for COVID testing and treatment for immigrants who are not eligible for regular Medicaid. And the normal requirements around providing detailed medical records have been waived for EMA coverage for COVID testing and treatment. The person just needs to write on the application that it's for COVID. There's also a special LIHEAP recovery crisis program, which is only available until funds run out. And my understanding is there are a lot of applications for that. So if people may need that, they should apply right away. And that's to cover either back bills or if they have received a shut-off notice. So there's pretty widespread eligibility for that among low-income individuals. So the county assistance offices, we talked already a little bit about cash assistance, SNAP, also called food stamps, and medical assistance. And I want to reiterate, very sadly, that the only people eligible for cash assistance in Pennsylvania are families with minor children, and those kids need to be related to the adults in the household. Doesn't need to be parents, could be grandparents, aunts or uncles, cousins, but the kids must be related to the adults in order to get TANF, or people who are pregnant. TANF stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. Pennsylvania used to have a program called General Assistance. It provided cash assistance for individuals who were disabled, for individuals who had experienced domestic violence, for individuals who were in drug and alcohol treatment programs, and for children who were unable to live with a family member and who were living with adults they were not related to. General assistance was eliminated in 2012. It was reinstated in 2018 as a result of litigation by colleagues of mine at CLS. It was eliminated again in 2019, and once again, we have a court challenge pending. So the maximum grant amounts that are listed here are the maximums for TANF for Philadelphia, for Allegheny County, and for a majority of counties in the state. There are some counties where the grant amounts are a little bit higher, and there are some counties where the grant amounts are even lower. These grant amounts are the maximum cash assistance that a family of that size can receive from TANF. And I want to point out that they have not increased since January 1st, 1990. So 30 plus years ago. They were not generous in January 1990, and they're beyond stingy today. We're down at about 22–23% of the federal poverty line. So deep poverty is defined as 50% of the federal poverty line. This is way beyond deep poverty. A couple of things to know. For Recipients of TANF, if they are working, there's a 50% earned income disregard. So half of their earnings do not affect their cash assistance. The other half reduce the cash assistance. Family members who receive SSI don't count, and neither does their income. So if you've got a mom and 2 kids, and one of the kids has a serious disability and is getting SSI, the mom and child would be, the mom and the other child would be considered a family of 2 for TANF purposes. They would receive $316 a month, and the second child would receive their SSI. The same thing, however, is not true for Social Security. So if a child is receiving Social Security on the other parent's account, for example, if a child is living with one parent and the other parent is deceased or disabled, and the child gets some Social Security children's benefits, that child must be part of the TANF household if another sibling needs TANF. And the child's Social Security will reduce the family's TANF. If child support is paid, the first $100 gets to be kept by the family if there's one child in the household, or up to $200 if there are 2 or more children in the household. And that child support does not affect the grant. Child support above that amount, however, is taken by the county assistance office and is kept to reimburse the state and federal governments for the TANF. The resource limit, resources in this context refers to property other than the house that you're living in. So if you owned non-resident property or savings, the resource limit for TANF is $1,000 regardless of the size of the family. So there are other TANF rules. The first are the work requirements. Unless the adult is exempt based on disability or caregiving for an infant or for a child with disabilities, or unless they have other good cause, they are required to participate in welfare to work activities. If they have good cause or are exempt, they can still volunteer. So for example, a parent may not be able to participate in welfare to work activities for the required 20 or 30 hours a week, but they may be able to go to an ESL class for a couple of hours a week. And they could volunteer to do that. There are sanctions for not participating as required in the welfare to work program. It's incredibly important for those sanctions to be appealed. 3 sanctions result in a lifetime ban. There are special allowances available for transportation and for childcare. And I want to say that most of the clients that we've seen who have been given a sanction for failure to participate in the welfare to work program have not been willfully refusing. They either have been dealing with domestic violence or sexual assault or addiction or mental health issues or physical health issues or some family crisis. It's incredibly important to communicate with the county assistance office. So they may have been in the midst of being homeless, of dealing with the aftermath of an assault, of trying to get healthcare needs of themselves or their kids met. But unless they have contacted the county assistance office and explained what's going on, they are very likely to be sanctioned. So it's incredibly important that if you're in communication with a family that's receiving TANF, that you talk through with them whether or not they might want or need to be excused from the work requirements, and if they have received a sanction, to assist them in appealing it or refer them to your local legal services program for that help. The child support cooperation requirement, which we're going to talk about in some more detail, is the other big requirement that people often experience as a barrier to receiving TANF. So the child support cooperation requirement says that if you get TANF for a child, you must cooperate in establishing paternity and child support. The penalty for non-cooperation is a loss of 25% of the grant. Given how stingy the grants are to begin with, losing 25% is a significant loss. But if there's a family that does not fit into the exceptions to cooperation, but who nonetheless feel that pursuing support would not be in the child's best interests, the family could choose to not cooperate and accept the hit, just accept the 25% penalty. The exceptions are for domestic violence, or if the child was conceived as the result of rape or incest, or if the child is an infant and the parent is considering giving the child up for adoption. There's a domestic violence verification form that we're going to work through in a couple of minutes in detail. You should use that form as well if the child was conceived as a result of rape or incest. There is a separate rape or incest form. I feel very strongly that because rape or incest are within the definition of domestic violence for the Department of Human Services, and we're going to talk about this, and the domestic violence verification form is much less intrusive, that it should always be used. The rape or incest form requires the individual to disclose to the county assistance office that her child was conceived as a result of rape or incest. And it's so hard for people even to disclose domestic violence generally. Asking someone to disclose that their child was conceived as a result of incest is just a really, to me, quite appalling intrusion. So I would strongly urge using the DV verification form. As I mentioned before, if child support is paid, up to $100 if there's one child, or up to $200 if there are two or more children in the household, gets paid to the family. The rest is kept by DHS. I want to say a couple of things about that. One is that it doesn't matter how many children the support is paid for. So you could have a mom and two kids, and those kids could have two different fathers. And if one father is paying $150 a month in support, the family gets to keep the whole $150 because there are two children in the household. It doesn't matter if the support is being paid for both of those kids. The other thing I want to mention is that if less than that amount is paid, so if there's one child and only $70 a month is paid in support, what the family gets to keep from the support is the $70. You don't get more than what's paid. During the pandemic, there are a couple of things that people should know. The first is that DHS has acknowledged that participation is not possible for most people during the pandemic. We've been very disturbed to see that some sanctions have continued to be imposed. So if you hear of anyone who is being sanctioned for not participating in welfare to work requirements, please always assist them in appealing and refer them to legal services, but now especially. Secondly, in some counties like Philadelphia, when someone applies for TANF, the information about the absent parent that family court would need in order to pursue a support case gets sent electronically to family court. And individuals are not required to physically go to family court until family court is ready to see them. In many other counties, however, as a condition of processing the application, applicants are told that they must go to family court and begin the support process and return to the county assistance office with proof from family court that they have cooperated. Because family courts have been closed around the state and county assistance offices have been closed around the state, the department has agreed that it is presuming that child support cooperation is being met, and applicants should not be told to physically go to family court at this time. In addition, TANF interviews normally are required to be in person, face-to-face at the county assistance office. During the pandemic, the department has agreed to do TANF application interviews by phone. So there are a set of good domestic violence rules that the department has established. And the guiding principle in setting up those rules that they've had is that they want to try and ensure that no one is endangered as a result of having to comply with a TANF requirement. The county assistance office can excuse domestic violence victims from TANF rules. Most TANF rules can be waived. The requests that are most frequent are to be excused from the work requirements, from child support cooperation, from time limits, and from other rules as necessary, particularly what's called verification. Normally, the county assistance offices want a piece of paper to approve everything. They want a piece of paper to show that the sky is blue and the grass is green. If they want pieces of paper that people are unable to get as a result of domestic violence or abuse, they can be excused from that verification. The way that you prove domestic violence for the county assistance office is with the domestic violence verification form, and we're going to go over that form. So this is the form. I'm going to try and zoom in on parts of it so that you can see it more clearly. It looks more complicated than it is. So, sorry, I'm not that skilled technologically. Okay, so at the top of the form, it asks for the individual's name and their case number. If you've got their welfare department, DHS county assistance office case number, fill that in. If they don't, and if they've got any notices from the county assistance office, that number will be on the notice, usually down at the bottom on the left-hand side. If they don't know their number, you can put in their social security number. If they don't have a social security number, you can put in the date of birth. This is just some information so the county assistance office knows whose form this is. Then in box 1, where it says good cause claim, you put in the name of the individual who's asking to be excused from program requirements. So if I were going to Kelly for help, we would put my name in. I, Amy Hirsch, request to be excused. And then we would check as many boxes as apply to me. So the first one is support cooperation. I might need to be excused from support cooperation, or I might feel that it would be relatively safe for me to cooperate in trying to get child support, and I want support, but that it would be dangerous for me to go to the welfare to work program. Reset is the box for the welfare to work program. The time limit provisions have two meanings. So the first time limit that's listed, that's called time out, is because Pennsylvania has a 5-year time limit on getting TANF. We don't talk about it a lot, and we don't think about it a lot, because we also have something called extended TANF, and that's the next box. And that's TANF for people after the 5 years is up. And there are multiple extended TANF tracks in Pennsylvania. And as a result of them, pretty much anyone who continues to need TANF after the 5 years in Pennsylvania is able to continue getting benefits. One of those extended TANF tracks is for victims of domestic violence. And if someone is applying for TANF who's already received 5 years, they would use this domestic violence verification form and check the extended TANF box. What the time out box refers to is that victims of domestic violence, and I should say I'm using the term victims because that's what the DHS regs use. I'm used to talking about survivors, but I'm using the language the county assistance office uses. The time out gives you 12 months of TANF eligibility that doesn't count towards the 5-year limit. Any domestic violence waiver request, so if you request to be excused from support cooperation or from the work requirements, or that you can't get your kid's birth certificate and you need extra time for that, any good cause waiver request will automatically get you that 12-month time out. So you don't have to worry about checking that box, so there's no harm in checking it. And then there's the box for other TANF or CCIS program requirement, please specify. I had a client who was unable to go to her local county assistance office because a relative of her abusive husband worked in that office, and she was terrified that she would be seen and that it would be reported to him that she was applying for benefits. So we asked to have the requirement that she apply at the nearest county assistance office waived and arranged to have her application taken elsewhere. You can think very creatively about the range of issues or barriers that might cause difficulty for your client in accessing TANF and ask to have those problems waived. So then you have to prove the domestic violence. And there are 3 ways to do that. And you can do it any of those 3 ways. You don't need all 3, all you need is one of them. So the first is records, and that's this blue section. If the individual has a protection from abuse order or a police report or court records or medical records or something from a social service agency, any records that would document the abuse, and if the individual is willing to provide those records, then you check the box, you attach the records, the form is done. That's all that you need. If either there are no records, or if those records contain other information that the individual is uncomfortable submitting to the county assistance office, then you don't need to provide those records. For example, if you have a client who was raped and beaten, and her medical records from the emergency department show that she had a broken arm and a sexually transmitted infection, she might feel that that information is just a little too personal and a little too much and not something she wants to share. She does not have to attach those records. So it's completely within her control. Then the way that you prove, the next way that you could prove it in the absence of records that you're submitting is the yellow section, authorization/verification by a third party. And here, if I had gone to Kelly for help, I would fill in, I authorize Kelly Yeckley to complete the verification below and to provide it to the Department of Public Welfare for the purpose of verifying my good cause. And then I need to sign and date it. I have often been asked by people at social service agencies who are working with someone where they're convinced that the person has been experiencing domestic violence or abuse. And they know that she is having difficulty with the county assistance office or believe that she will, and they want to submit the form. But the individual has not disclosed that abuse. And they want to know, can I just go ahead and submit the form? And the answer is no. You must have permission from the client to complete and submit the form. So then Kelly, having gotten my permission, would fill in her name, her title, plan as her organizational affiliation, her office address, and she would check that she's a legal representative. If you look at the choices for the different people who can complete this form, there is no human being on the planet who cannot complete this form. A domestic violence service provider, a medical, psychological, or social service provider, a law enforcement professional, a county children and youth representative, a legal representative, an acquaintance, friend, relative, neighbor of the claimant, or other. So anyone who has the information, anyone to whom the victim of domestic violence has disclosed that there has been violence or abuse can sign the third-party verification. You have to sign it where it says third-party signature and put the date. You will notice that nowhere on this form does it ask for the name of the abuser or any relationship between the victim and the abuser. The definition of domestic violence for the Department of Human Services is extremely broad. It's a really good definition. Unlike getting a protection from abuse order, it does not require any relationship. It includes sexual assault, physical assault, emotional abuse, threats of abuse, threats of harm to a child, a wide, wide definition. So you can use this form for any circumstance in which an individual who is applying for TANF has been abused or threatened with abuse or a victim of violence of any type. So if someone was injured by a stranger on the street, if someone was assaulted by their landlord, if they were sexually harassed by a coworker, if they were sexually harassed by an employer, it does not need to have been within a family. And the department has said very explicitly in the regulations and in the cash assistance handbook that the same rules apply to any type of violence that a family that's applying for benefits may have experienced. The third way that someone can prove that they have experienced abuse, if they are so isolated or embarrassed or afraid that they have not disclosed to anyone, or in a circumstance where everybody knows what's happening, but everyone is too afraid. Even though the form doesn't ask for the name of the abuser, people can still nonetheless feel intimidated and afraid and unwilling to sign. So box 4, the green box, is self-affirmation. And it allows an individual to self-affirm that they need to be excused from these requirements because it would otherwise put them at risk. And they date and sign it. And then the form is complete. So the form can be completed either with records or with third-party verification, or if those are unavailable, with self-affirmation. And then it gets submitted to the county assistance office.
Amy, I'm just going to interrupt right here. I apologize, but I need to launch the first of the CLE credit poll boxes. So if you're an attorney participating in the webinar, please respond to that. And if you don't mind, I have a question for you from the waiver form, if that's okay, Amy?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Please explain more on reset option on the waiver request with examples.
Sure. So the reset, what reset refers to is the welfare to work requirements. An individual might be unable to participate in that for a number of different reasons related to having experienced abuse. So for example, the location of the welfare to work program might be a location where her abuser can find and assault her if the abuser knows where that program is. Or she may need to be going to court, finding a new place to live, getting her kids into counseling, getting counseling for herself. So she may be able to participate at a future date, but need a period of time to take care of everything else that she has to take care of. A couple of other examples. I had a client whose 3-year-old had unfortunately been sexually abused in childcare. And under no circumstances was this parent going to put her child into childcare again. And she needed to be excused from the welfare to work program in order to care for her child because of that history of abuse that the child had experienced at a very young age in childcare. So there can be a lot of different factual circumstances that will result in someone needing to be excused from the welfare to work program, from the reset program, either for a short period of time or for a much longer period of time.
I have another question, quick, Amy.
Sure.
Do you ever see DV waivers questioned or denied? Is it better to mark records if you have them, or should folks just do whatever is easiest?
People should either do records or third-party verification. The self-affirmation was included really as a fail-safe, as a safety net, to be sure that individuals who didn't have anyone who could assist them in completing the form had a way to self-verify. I do worry about the possibility of a backlash if a lot of people use self-affirmation. And so I strongly encourage either submitting records if you have them or and are comfortable with them, or completing the third-party verification. Early on, when these rules were first implemented, we saw a lot of instances of confusion at the county assistance office. So we saw people who were told that they had to have all 3 parts. We saw people who were told that they had to have the form notarized. I haven't heard anything like that in a really long time. I have very occasionally heard of instances where the county assistance office was asking inappropriate questions. For example, asking, well, do you have bruises? Or just how bad was the abuse? Or tell me the details. That's completely inappropriate. And in each of those instances when we complained, the individual caseworker was told that that was not appropriate to do, and they received some additional education. The Department of Human Services has provided each of the county assistance offices with information about local domestic violence programs. And if a client wants counseling or further services, they're supposed to give them the information about that program, but they are never supposed to ask those types of questions. So if you hear that people are being questioned or that waivers are being denied, please reach out to me. I and Peter Zerfli from the Community Justice Project have done a bunch of advocacy at different points as needed, also along with the Women's Law Project. Kelly, is it okay to go ahead?
It is. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I already mentioned that the domestic violence rules apply to other types of violence. And this is incredibly important because this is different from other contexts. So this is quite different from protection from abuse proceeding, for example. I mentioned, so that's the presentation about TANF. I want to mention a couple of things about the Emergency Assistance Program. As I said before, apply right away. It's only for families with minor children and pregnant women. It has a couple of specific requirements that are different from regular TANF. So the first is that the person must have been employed as of March 11th and lost their job or lost at least half of their earnings after March 11th as a result of COVID or the pandemic. So it doesn't have to be that they themselves had COVID. It could just be, well, there was a stay-at-home order and my employer laid me off. What the Emergency Assistance Program provides is a one-time payment equal to 2 months of TANF. So depending on the family size, if it's a mom and 2 kids and the monthly grant would be $403, it's a one-time payment of $806. The resource limit is the same as for regular TANF, but the income limits are way, way higher. So a family may be able to get EAP despite having some other income. And very importantly, there are no child support cooperation or work requirements connected to the Emergency Assistance Program. So this is a really useful program for individuals who were working, who may be waiting for unemployment comp to start. We all know there have been terrible problems at the Department of Labor and Industry with the massive tidal wave of applications and issues in their computer system. So lots of people who should be getting unemployment comp have not yet received it. This may be of some assistance to them while they're waiting to get unemployment comp. And it's also helpful for families who expect to return to work fairly quickly. If a family is likely to need ongoing TANF, they should apply for regular TANF. And I should say during that 2 month, you get, with Emergency Assistance Program, you get a one-time payment for those 2 months. You cannot get regular TANF during those 2 months because you got this one-time payment to cover those 2 months. So if you think you're going to need TANF for 3, 4, 5 months or longer, go ahead and apply for regular TANF. This is a flyer which you'll receive about the Emergency Assistance Program. And again, it's time limited. It's going to end July 12th or sooner if the funds have all been spent. So urge people to apply right away. You can see the monthly income limits there. They are way, way higher than regular TANF. I want to very briefly mention SSI. If you're working with an individual, either an adult or if they've got a child who is disabled, it's well worth applying for SSI if they have not already. And I also want to remind everyone that you can get SSI based on age for people who are 65 or older, as long as they're low income. One of the things that we see from time to time, and it always startles me, is an elderly person who is getting Social Security but not SSI, and whose Social Security is lower than the SSI amount. So for example, if someone is 85 and is getting $600 a month in Social Security, they should be getting another $200 a month in SSI. Assuming they don't have savings of more than $2,000 for one person or $3,000 for a couple. There are a couple of advantages to SSI in addition to the monthly payment amounts being so much higher than TANF. You automatically get Medicaid, and you automatically get a $22 a month state supplement. And as I said back at the beginning, if you've got one member of a family that's getting TANF who has SSI, that person can't get both TANF and SSI, but none of their income or resources count in looking at TANF eligibility for the rest of the family. So this is an incredibly important resource. And it could be either a child in the family getting SSI, or it could be the parent. So if you have a parent with 2 kids and the parent has a disability, if the parent gets approved for SSI, they can still receive TANF for the 2 children with the parent's income and resources, the SSI, not counting. And if that parent has income in addition to the SSI, for example, I had a client who was a woman in her 20s who had a serious disability. She got SSI for herself. She had a baby. The baby got TANF. My client decided to see whether she could work at least part-time despite having a disability. That's perfectly legitimate. She went ahead and did that. Of course, she needed to report her earnings to Social Security. But because she received SSI, none of her income, not her SSI and not her earnings, none of her income affected the TANF for her child. So SNAP benefits, food stamp benefits, almost all low-income people are eligible. SNAP gets issued to households who live together and purchase and prepare food together. So if you're living with someone you're not related to, you don't have to be on SNAP together as long as you're purchasing and preparing food separately. Young adults who are under age 22 who live with their parents must be part of their parents' SNAP households. Elderly and disabled individuals, and you have to be both. You have to be both 60 or older and have a disability in order to get your own SNAP, even if you're purchasing and preparing food with the family you're living with or other individuals you're living with. The SNAP income limit is 160% of the federal poverty line. And we do not currently have a resource limit for SNAP in Pennsylvania. So these are the maximum SNAP amounts. As I mentioned before, there are emergency allotments that are going out. So if you had a one-person household and they had some income and they were getting $100 a month in SNAP, they are automatically getting another $94 a month. The regular SNAP allotments come in the first half of the month, and the SNAP emergency allotments are coming in the second half of the month. People received emergency allotments for March and April in April. They received an emergency allotment in May. Emergency allotments are going out in the second half of June. The emergency allotments will continue as long as there is both a federal public health emergency and a state public health emergency or disaster declaration. So we are hoping that they will continue for several more months at least, although USDA is approving them on a month-by-month basis. And as I mentioned before, we are continuing to fight to try and get emergency allotments for everyone on SNAP so that the 40% of SNAP recipients who receive the maximum grant, who are the poorest individuals, will get something. And we don't yet know what's going to happen with that. People can get expedited SNAP. People sometimes say emergency, but the magic word is expedited if they're talking to the county assistance office. A new applicant should get expedited SNAP within 5 days, not 5 business days, 5 calendar days of submitting the application. If they have less than $100 on hand and less than $150 in gross monthly income, or if their shelter costs, including utilities, are more than their monthly income and cash on hand. And I should say, in looking at that, most people get credit for $594 a month in utility expenses and looking at SNAP eligibility. People don't need to have submitted all of the proof in order to get expedited SNAP, but they will need to do that, and they will need to have an interview in order to get ongoing SNAP. And one confusion that we see a lot is that people think because they get approved for expedited SNAP for that first month of SNAP, that they're done, that they've met the requirements, and they either don't submit the outstanding verification that's remaining to be submitted, or they don't have the interview, and then they get cut off. And they need to complete the full application process in order to get ongoing SNAP. And they can't get expedited SNAP if they need it in the future if they haven't completed the ongoing application process. SNAP can help with education expenses. So adults who get SNAP but not TANF can get the same special allowances and childcare subsidies to go to school or for job skill training that TANF families can get. It's critically important, though, that they need to get the appropriate paperwork completed with the department. It's called an employment development plan, and they need to do that before they pay out of pocket for any expenses, or the county assistance office will refuse to pay for that type of expense. Not just whatever's been paid out of pocket, but for that whole type of expense. There are rules about time limits and SNAP that currently only apply in a couple of counties. They were threatened to be expanded to the entire state. The expansion of those rules, the application of what's called the ABAWDS rules to the whole state, was put on hold, partly by Congress because of the pandemic, and partly by a preliminary injunction in a court case. We don't know what's going to happen with that longer term. At the moment, what's still in effect in Pennsylvania is the ABAWD time limit for Centre County, Chester County, parts of Lancaster County, and parts of Montgomery County, but not in the rest of the state. And because of the high unemployment that's resulted from the pandemic, we've urged the department to ask to have those 4 counties completely waived at this time. Also, I don't know yet what's going to happen with that. Kelly, are we out of time?
It looks like we have a minute to go.
Okay.
Do you have much more you'd like to get through?
We could stop here. I can tell people that there are a number of additional slides with more Medicaid information, and you'll receive the full PowerPoint by email, so you'll have that information. I do want to just briefly say that it's incredibly important to appeal. Our mantra on appealing is appeal now, think later. The timeframes for County Assistance Office appeals are extremely short. So if someone's getting benefits and they get a cutoff notice or reduction notice, if they appeal within 15 days, not of when they received that notice, but of when it was put in the mail to them, they are entitled to have their benefits continue while their appeal is pending. So it's incredibly important to get an appeal in as soon as someone gets a notice that says that their benefits are being cut off or reduced. The appeal can always be withdrawn. It can't do harm to appeal. So please, please, please assist people in appealing. And then we can figure out whether or not the notice was erroneous. Do you need to do another poll, Kelly?
Yes, I'm right now launching the second poll question for attorneys who are requesting CLE credit for participation in today's webinar. While we give that a few seconds, if anybody has any questions they would like to ask Amy quickly before we end for the day, please feel free to type them in the chat box now. And Amy, I'd like to thank you for being with us today and offering or being willing to do this training for us. This is really very helpful information.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you everyone for participating.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions coming in and no more new responses to the poll box. So Amy, if you don't have anything else, we will bid everyone a good afternoon and thank you for your participation.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you, take care.